Good afternoon. I am together with Benedict Moran, an award-winning journalist and an independent filmmaker. You have been working with many renowned outlets, world outlets like British Guardian, CBS in America, Al Jazeera, which we know from Turkey as well. And you are being called as an expert on crisis reporting and also mostly presented as a virtual reality journalist. I want to start with that. What is virtual reality journalism?
So virtual reality and 360 is it's a new type of video and it's a new type of filmmaking that tries to be more immersive and to increase the presence of the viewer.
As a viewer, for example, that we will be feeling like we are inside a building or something. Yeah. Could you a little bit elaborate on that? I mean, from your projects, maybe you can tell about, because most recently I think you went to South Sudan to film about the famine there.
Sure. So a while ago we went to South Sudan, and the idea was we filmed a 360 virtual reality film in South Sudan to cover an issue that most people are not familiar with, and that's the ongoing civil war and a famine that was potentially happening in South Sudan. And the reason why we chose virtual reality is because we wanted people to go to South Sudan, to be able to go onto the ground and see and experience what it's like to be there and to be challenged with all these complexities of living in a conflict zone, not having enough to eat and all that stuff. And virtual reality really provided us a way to show sides of the story that were very hard to explain using just radio or script or in a normal TV format, for instance.
But the terminology, I mean, when you say virtual reality, you don't mean that you create another reality.
No, not at all. Especially that's when people are saying virtual reality journalism. I think, you know, like all films, there's nonfiction and there's fiction. In the case of what I do specifically, we try to do a journalistic work using the new media of virtual reality. And so we are restricted in that way, that we want to have a high standard of ethics, that we want to, you know, try to eliminate bias, for instance, if there's a perspective, that we have to have it within the framework of journalism. And so using that in a way that helps people educate themselves about a very important issue.
Could you elaborate on that, really, because it's a documentary type of work you do, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
And and it's also journalistic. You go to, for example, Warzone, that I think you went to Iraq, Mosul, crisis. But are you also putting other elements that not on the ground, or how do you create the feeling that as if, as an audience, we are inside that situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the filmmaker, and it depends whether or not it's a journalistic piece or whether it's a documentary. And I think that there's an important division there. A documentary filmmaker has a perspective and sometimes does add things that are not from the environment, for instance, in order to make the film more immersive and more powerful and compelling for the viewer. In the case of journalism, you're limited in that you can only use the material that you collect on the ground. That's kind of a rule across the board that most outlets follow. And so in this case of Iraq, the filmmaking took place over 2 weeks, and we used only the material that we gathered while we were there.
Because you work in a new medium in that sense, I mean virtual reality filming, 360 you call it, do you look at what's going on ground in a different way, because you're also...
Yeah. So just to step back a bit, I think it'd be helpful to define the difference between 360 and virtual reality. All of this is kind of what's called immersive media, and that is in 360. Basically, you're seeing a film. You know, people see it on Facebook a lot, and you're watching it on Facebook on your computer, for instance. But you're not wearing a headset. In a virtual reality film, you pretty much need to be wearing the headset, and it's much more immersive. And that's a very different distinction between the two.
Okay, then it is like, you know, I think in Turkey we know that there are cinemas for that. They shake you while you are watching. It's the kind of that feeling, is it?
Sort of, except it's using a more specific technology.
Right.
Sometimes the headset is, sometimes they add additional elements that are like haptic, they call them, so you can feel, or the temperature of the room, or the smell, or the sound is accentuated alongside the video.
Isn't this expensive?
It's extremely expensive, especially, so the consumption is expensive, obviously, because of the headset, and you need a smartphone. Or you need a specific headset that's made by, you know, Oculus, which is owned by Facebook, or HTC. Those things are in the hundreds of dollars. But the production of immersive media, just to give you an example, only a couple years ago, at high-end production, cost about $100,000 per minute.
Oh my God!
It's very expensive.
Yeah.
It's way cheaper now. It is definitely accessible to a freelance or an independent journalist. They just have to, or an independent filmmaker. They just have to learn how to do it. I think there are new skills that they need to learn how to do. There's new post-production skills, how to edit, how to manipulate this media, and that's what they have to learn.
How then it's part of the technology changing and giving us new abilities. Will it be the, you know, just when you tell like that, the journalist will go to again, for example, to the war zone or some crisis, to whatever he wants or she wants to tell. But the audience no more need to go somewhere, kind of, you know.
I mean, I think it depends on the audience. I think that people should always travel, and it's important for people to make a personal connection with a real object and a real person. But not everyone is able to do that. Not everyone is able to go to South Sudan or to Syria or to Iraq or the Congo or these places. And the ability of, if a filmmaker is able to really make a more compelling film and to increase the presence, the feeling of presence for the audience, it will make the experience of the film so much more powerful, and it doesn't necessitate that they travel all that way.
Yeah.
And so I think it will open up an important tool for filmmakers to educate people.
Interesting, because when you were telling this, I began to think that I wish I could do a journey done by a migrant, for example, a Syrian person, starting, for example, somewhere in Syria in the wartime, and then going to Turkey, maybe later via agency across. That would be very impactful because, for example, in Turkey we have so many Syrians, and xenophobia is getting, you know, higher. So I believe if they can see why they are coming, or in a different perspective, which we cannot tell maybe with the other medium, that would be interesting. Do you think it helps like that?
So that's a question. What you're getting at is whether or not this new filmmaking technique, 360 or VR films, helps with empathy. That's a question that everyone asks. Do people become more empathetic, or do they understand the characters more in this medium? And a number of studies have come out this year that demonstrate that people are, in fact, better able to understand the conditions in which someone is living if they see it in 360 or if they see it in a virtual reality environment. Depends on how the film is done. It depends, for instance, if there's one character, if there's one Syrian refugee that you follow from Syria to Turkey and you create a connection with them, there could be a more impactful, there could be more impact on the audience to not only understand and feel for the refugee, but to take action and want to help them.
Right, but maybe you can also direct the film from the perspective of Mr. President Trump, from the Mexican border, all sure. those, yeah, so just the opposite effect as well.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's the tricky part of our job, maybe. Okay, this also brings us to the why you are here. You are invited by Memory Center. I will Hafıza Merkezi in Turkish. which works on the disappeared and the tortured people in Turkish history. It's a long history of people being beaten, tortured, and disappeared, forcefully disappeared. And they were trying to find ways, as human rights defenders, to tell their story in a different medium because they are under pressure. I think all around the world it is the same, but in Turkey it's a little bit much more, their conditions are much more harsher. Mm-hmm. So how do you connect to that? I mean, is it a real, do you think this new technology is a good tool for specifically human rights defenders rather than, for example, other jobs or other professions? So
I think we're in an important window right now in that this is a new technology and people are very interested in testing it out. And those studies that I was just referring to do show that if someone has never seen virtual reality, the first time they put it on a headset, the first time they see a film, it has the most impact. And then as they get used to it, there's a decreasing amount of impact. So given that it's a new medium here and everywhere, I think it can be a useful tool for people working in human rights to communicate stories that are not told. Memory, you know, especially working on memory, like the Memory Center does. So I hope that there is a strong interest here to work on this and to develop a body of filmmakers in 360, working in 360. And so I hope they continue. But at the same time, we are in the age of post-truths or fake news, and having something as virtual, as not the real, but virtual reality around you that you're watching, maybe people could be suspicious about what they are getting in, which, for example, they can think that this is created for them. So how about that? Yeah, I think that there's an ethical dilemma if you're making a film that is partially created by CG, for instance. And a lot of virtual reality is created using a computer program, in fact, or it's recreated using various techniques. And I mean, I think it's an important debate to be had, but in general, the fake news phenomenon is, if you're watching a 10-minute documentary, I think you're less susceptible to fake news, for instance, versus a very, you know, I'm not an expert on fake news, but a lot of that is on social media, it's on Facebook, and it's snippets of information that people passively kind of consume and then share. How long normally the films you make? Can you make a virtual reality journalistic work like 2 hours or? Yeah, no. Yeah, okay. So there are technical limitations still that the quality of the video is still quite low when you consume it, and that has to do with the quality of the actual monitors that you're watching it on. But basically, in my personal experience, the sweet spot is about 4 to 5 minutes. It's actually very short. Oh. Because it's a new medium, people are not used to consuming it and used to seeing it. So if you ask someone to watch something that's 15 minutes, it's already a lot. And some films are 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's exhausting. If you wear a headset for 30 minutes, it's so overwhelming on your body, on your mind, because of the stimulation that you're getting. People need to take a break. It's too much. So I think it's the best is around 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Then it's very good to use in social media, which makes it also susceptible to the fake news. It depends on, again, it depends where it's released, it depends how it's released, it depends how it's used. Okay. All media can be manipulated. As I understand, you work with many companies, so they really want to incorporate virtual reality into their newsrooms then. Exactly. Could you talk about that, why they choose to do that? Well, I think that a lot of these outlets, you know, from the New York Times to The Guardian, BBC, to more direct wires, AP, for instance, they see it as the next frontier. You know, from radio to television, it totally changed how journalists and how nonfiction storytellers in general tell stories and recount and talk about the human experience and share information in general. So now going from TV to or in video in general, to 360 video and virtual reality, I think they're seeing it as the next frontier, and no one quite knows how to tell a story. There's an example people talk about. When TV was developed, they effectively started to do radio on the TV. They didn't know what video was, and they were just kind of imitating radio, but on video. And it took a decade for them to understand, oh, it's a totally different medium. They have to kind of start from scratch about figuring out how to do a story, how to write a story. In the case of virtual reality, there's a lot of imitation going on. People need to experiment, and that's what this interest that we're seeing in these major outlets is. They're trying to figure out how to tell stories in this new medium. Whether or not virtual reality is kind of the last step, some people say it's going to progress into what's called augmented reality, which is basically it's a new type of, it's also immersive media, but it's different.
Just how it's different, a technology that superimposes a computer-generated image on a user's view of real world.
So exactly. So for augmented reality, for instance, virtual reality is you'd wear a headset and everything is recreated. It's a completely immersive experience. Augmented reality, you could be wearing just a small set of glasses, and there would be, the cup would pop up, for instance. But it's in your physical environment. And it's a lot, it's less...
Google is working on that, isn't it?
Many companies are working on this. And they suspect more compatible with people's everyday consumption. One of the main limitations of VR is that the headset is very clunky, and again, price. And so the main industry for that might be like people who buy Nintendos, these like game consoles. Gaming is really big in VR. But for everyday life, for everyday consumption of video, I think AR is going to be the next frontier.
Okay, it's interesting. And also, I think we just passed that, I couldn't get the question of, the answer of my question regarding what do you use to shoot?
Sure.
Is it small when you go to the field, you are light or not? And also, how long you have to shoot, for example, 5 minutes?
So I think that's interesting. So the cameras, the qualities range. There are cameras that are in the $200 range. Those are consumer cameras. And there are decent cameras that are in the $1,000 range. The most expensive virtual reality ones, they go up to $100,000 for one that was just developed. And basically that camera is able to do 360 virtual reality live streaming. And it has 16 cameras, and it's simultaneously stitching them all for you. But that's obviously an extremely expensive piece of equipment. So it's possible to do with a limited budget and using elements that you just have on your backpack. One of the main differences with normal filmmaking is you can't direct necessarily. If you're doing nonfiction VR, and as a director, you don't want to be in the film.
Right.
The film, it's filming everything, top, bottom, and 360. And so you basically start recording and you have to leave and hide around the corner. What that means is you can't necessarily direct what's happening. There are benefits to that, though. Sometimes you get some really genuine experience, genuine moments that you film because you're not there, and maybe the person you're filming kind of forgets about the camera.
Right.
Another thing that
or a cat might come and just jump off the camera.
Yeah, of course, and that happens. Or someone steals the camera, or something like that. And in general, you were asking about the differences in like editing.
Yeah.
Shots need to be much longer. You can't, some in TV, it's like 1 second, half a second, 2 seconds. You can't do that. It'll make sometimes it makes the viewer want to throw up. It's too overwhelming. And so generally it's a 10-second shot that you need to edit in. And that means if you're going to do a 5-minute piece, you're doing a series of very long shots that allows people the time to look around and to experience it.
Why did you get into this VR business? As a journalist?
By chance, I was at Columbia University in New York, And that's one of the universities that is kind of studying what is this new film technology and what are the implications for journalism. So in that world, I was connected to various people, and we've been working on 360 Sense.
And was it the urge of storytelling that made you go to Colombia? Or why are you a journalist?
Yeah, that is. The urge for me is to educate. And, journalism, they're very important elements of journalism is to educate people and to challenge power. And it's a very important institution in any country. And so I deeply believed in the importance of telling stories that help people understand the human experience and connect people across borders.
What you said is important in Turkey's context, especially challenging power, which is very difficult these days as journalists in Turkey. But do you think these new technologies help journalists in that sense, or they are only tools? And as a journalist, you have to be yourself courageous.
Yeah, I think that it's more the latter. I think, virtual reality is not something that's going to be super impactful when it comes to investigative journalists. Like if you're going to be reporting on bank fraud or something like that, VR is going to be kind of less useful for you.
Yes,
right?
maybe in the wrong direction, because maybe people will be tempted to do the same.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's always hard. Telling a visual story that involves lots of information, data, it's sometimes very difficult because you need to simplify it so much in order for the person to feel and to understand. So I think it is more conducive towards more general human experiences, but not necessarily that there's a recent film about Greenland, about climate change.
Oh, yes.
And what VR is very good at doing is taking people to another environment, transporting them to a new place. And all it does basically is it takes the viewer to a new place. And there's no major character there. The character is the environment. And it helps people, I think, understand climate change in a different way. And that's an important role that journalists have to do.
Maybe as lastly, because I know that you have been in Turkey, you went to Iraq and Syria, all different parts of the world. I think 80 worked in more than 80 countries. Could you just, as a journalist, tell about, because mostly you worked on the war zones, isn't it? Crisis zones. Is it so or not?
I would say that I work in areas that are in transition from and that are developing. I don't exclusively report in conflict zones by any means. My interest is more in development, and sometimes conflict arises in many countries that are going through.
Development means change.
Exactly.
Some people would like status quo keep on going on, so that's what you mean. Could you tell us that seeing so many, because everybody's, some people wants to be a journalist because they think that we all travel. That's not the case. We should be honest about that. But how about your work going these places and telling the story? I mean, is the VR really the medium, or would you sometimes rather want to write about something?
Oh, very much. I think that there's 4 major mediums now, media. There's radio, there's print, there's linear video, and then there's 360 immersive video. And I love writing. I think the foundation of journalism is print. It's how people consume most information. But I also think radio is great as well. And radio can be a very a powerful way to connect with other humans in a way that is much more immersive in a way than VR, because you're hearing someone's story in in a way that somehow, because of how the human mind works, you can understand and hear much more closely. Video, obviously, when it comes to things like weather or a war or something like that, you need to do it on video. People want to see what it's like if it's hard to understand.
So can we say that, I mean, this radio and writing, they're both more thought-provoking mediums, rather the others are sensation-provoking mediums. Do you think?
I think you could, but I don't. I think writing can be powerfully can cause a very powerful emotional experience as well as radio. But
I mean, how about everything is getting shorter and shorter in these days? I mean, how can you be? I mean, what is because VR is good, as I understand, you in a very short time, you can tell a very big story in a very powerful way. But how about writing getting shorter and everything is getting shorter? Do you think the span of the people,
attention span.
The attention span is getting...
For sure. It's getting significantly... I mean, I'm not that old, but even in my lifetime, we've all experienced how people's attention spans are getting shorter. And it's harder and harder to get them to care, or to like click on a story. That has to do not necessarily with people's attention spans getting shorter, but more people are being bombarded with information that they're, on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, all this, and it's overwhelming. And so the biggest challenge is how do you get through that cloud and tell a good story that they want to listen to and that they will connect with.
And also that maybe their attitudes will change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's challenging.
Thank you very much, Benedict Moran, for being with us today. Yeah, we worked together with Benedict Moran, an award-winning journalist, and we tried to learn more about the virtual reality journalism. We will be again with you. Thank you for watching.